All right, I will say good morning, Baruch Hashem, an incredible schus to be able to continue in our journey of Sanhedrin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual TALMUD Torah sponsor, for Tafshin Pei, the Tilson Mishpacha. From dedicating all the Shumer Drashos this year in the schus of Besaros Tovos for Am Yisroel. Our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Haba Linu Lutova, Teri and Steve Zinn, loving memory of Teri's father, Dr. Harry Kahn, Tzvi Herschel ben Yosef HaKohen, on the occasion of his 12th Yahrzeit, and the Ziv, Lavine, and Behrman families in memory of Mr. Willian Ziv, Zev Shmuel ben Yisroel, Zechron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, all of the Neshamos Havin Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah Shavon together, called the Chol Yisroel, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu Meretz Hashem bring home all of our hostages, and may our holy soldiers be successful. B'chol ma'asei yedeihem. So with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. A lot to do today. Today's daf is Ayin Zayin 77. We are picking up on Ayin Vav Amavez 276b, 12 lines down from the top. Tan Rabbanon. Some really beautiful Gemara today. Tan Rabbanon. Ha'oiv eschinov, person who loves his neighbors. V'amakariv es krovov, and he goes ahead and he brings his relatives close. V'hanose es bas achoso, and he marries his niece. He marries his sister's daughter. V'amalva selo ani b'shas dochko, and he lends money to an ani, to a poor person, at a time that the ani is struggling. Alava kasav omer az tikra v'Hashem ya'aneh. When you call out, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will answer. So we'll say a really beautiful Gemara, because so many times, right, we go through life and we're wondering what exactly is like the recipe for success, right? What do I want more than anything? I want to know that when I reach out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, He's going to answer. Right? I want to know that when I need something, that Ribono Shel Olam is going to be there. So what kind of person do I need to be? What is it that I need to do in order to have responsiveness, right? Responsiveness from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? What is it that I need to do in order to make sure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be there for me? And it's so beautiful. Sometimes Chazal give you these formulas. So what's the formula for success? Someone who loves his neighbors, which means, what's interesting about your neighbors is, although to a certain degree you could try to choose them, right? Because you could choose where you live. Once you go ahead and you move somewhere, you definitely can't control who lives around you, right? What's after that? What's after that is Makariv Krovov, someone who brings his relatives close. You certainly can't choose your relatives. Maybe certain relatives you do choose, but a lot of relatives you don't choose. So what's the common denominator over here? The common denominator is a person who's able to get along with other people. A person who's able to go and forge relationships. You get along with your neighbors. You get along with your relatives. You are an agreeable person. Vanose is basachoso is the same idea. Now, actually, the truth is, you see this comes in Chazal more, but Chazal's almost like focus on marrying one's niece, your sister's daughter, but leaving aside the actual marriage of a niece. The idea, if you think about it, it represents really relationships going from, I would say, further out to closer in. There's neighbors, relatives, and a niece. So we know this in life, that sometimes the most difficult, the most challenging relationships are the ones that are closest to you. Right? Those are the most challenging relationships. You like to think, of course you get along with your family, right? Of course you get along with your spouse. Of course you get along. No, that's actually, sometimes it's the people that are closest to you that you have the most difficult time forging a meaningful relationship with you. So if I could be the kind of person, and we're going from outside the circle to inside the circle, who could get along with my neighbors, who could get along with my relatives, who could get along, again, with my spouse, right? Which Chazal are terming it as the sister of my niece, with myself. If I could do that, and I will say, what does it take to build relationships in life? What does it take? What does it take? I quoted this a million patients. I've taken this there's no wrong answer to this, by the way, because it takes a lot of things. But I think on a most basic level, the primary need that it takes to build relationships in life is vatranos, willingness to yield. A willingness to yield. Like Rabbi Nachman writes, I've quoted this many times, but best line Rabbi Nachman, Tov lihios vatron. That's it. Tov Yosef. It's good to be mevater. It's good to yield. It's good to yield. It's good not to always have to have everything your way. It's good to be able to know how to sometimes give in to the other because it's just not worth the fight. And if you think about it, in each and every one of these relationships, you need to be a mevater. You want good neighborly relations? What do you need? You need to know how to be a mevater. Why? Because at some point in time, your neighbor, whatever they're going to do, they're going to leave their trash out, or their trash is going to blow onto your lawn, or perhaps they have a dog and the dog gets loose and nestles itself in your backyard for prolonged amounts of time. It just could happen. It could happen, right? So if you want to have relationships with your neighbors, vatron. You want to have relationships with your family, you have to be mevater. You want to have shalom bayis with your wife, you have to learn how to be mevater. You have to learn how to yield. Otherwise, all of these relationships become unsustainable. And the Gemara says, if you're the kind of person who could create relationships with others, Chilish Baruch Hu says, I promise I'll have a relationship with you as well. I'll have a relationship with you as well. How does that relationship manifest itself? That when you call out to me, as tikra, you call out to me, and Hashem will go ahead and listen to you. And of course, that last one is the ani. They both say it's interesting because the way to read that ani case is hamalva sela ani b'shas dochko. So the way it's understood is you're lending money to an ani at a time that an ani is having difficulty. So I was looking at this last night, maybe because it was just late, so looking at it, realized, but it doesn't make sense. It's interesting because what does it mean, an ani who's struggling? By definition, if you're an ani, then what? Then you're struggling. So maybe it means like this. Hamal v'as ani b'shas dolko doesn't mean that you lend money to a struggling ani. What it means is you lend money b'shas dolko even when you're struggling. It's talking about the lender. It's easy to be about tzedakah, and it's easy to be mevater, and it's all the same midah of vatronas. Because what's tzedakah? Tzedakah is yielding with your money. It's my money. I worked for it. I worked very hard for it. I earned it. Why should I give it away? That's what it means to be mevater. You have to have emotional vatronos, and you have to have financial vatronos. So if I'm the kind of person who is financially mevatel, financially yielding, and I help another person out even when I'm having a difficult time. The Gemara says, Chazal say, you're that kind of person. You're mevater for people. You're mevater emotionally. You're mevater financially. You're yielding. You're giving. Kodesh Baruch Hu says, if that's the kind of person you are for others, I promise I'll be there for you as well. Incredible Gemara. All right, let's go weiter. Back to Treifa. Also, Vashan. So the pasuk says over here, quoting, this is the Isha Shayikach es Isha ve'es ima zimahi. So this is if a man marries a woman and her mother. So it's znos. Ba'esh yisrofu also ve'es hen. So this is interesting. They'll be burned by fire, Treifa. Also him, the perpetrator, ve'es hen, plural. Now both say, b'pashtos, what the Torah is telling me over here is, once you're married to Rachel, right? Once Reuven is married to Rachel, he can't marry Rachel's mother. And if he does so, it's punishable by Sreifa. Now, I say, who's punishable by Sreifa? It doesn't, Rachel didn't do anything, right? Rachel just married Reuven legally. The fact that Reuven then goes and marries Rachel's mother, that's on Reuven and the mother. So why does it say that Reuven and Eshen and them, plural, both women, are put to death? That can't be what it means. So the Gemara says as follows. So, Osovi Eshen, Osovi Es Achas men to Rabbi Shmuel. No, Rabbi Shmuel means that Reuben is put to death with one of these women, i.e. the mother-in-law. Rabbi Kiva says, Oso v'yashtan. Rabbi Kiva says, no, it means him and both of them. So what's going on over here? My bad, what exactly is the machlokis over here? What's the machlokis over here is how to dash in the pasuk. How so? Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Oso v'eshen. The pasuk says, right, we say that we go ahead and we put to death Reuven and them, plural, Osovi es achas mehen. It really means eshen, doesn't mean both of them. Eshen means achas mehen. It's a contraction. One of them. Or in other words, one of the women. Shekin b'lashon Yavani Korin la'achas hina, because apparently in Greek, the word for one is hina. It's hina, so eshen, one of them. Ve'em chamoso, midrasha asya. And I will say this pasuk is not, and ultimately again, the mother of his mother-in-law is learned that from a different drasha. Rabbi Kiva Savar, osovi eshen. What does that mean? Osovi es shtehen. So it means him and both of them. What does it mean, him and both of them? Ve'em chamoso hacha ksiva. And again, Rabbi Shmuel is learning out the prohibition. Sorry, Rabbi Akiva is learning out the prohibition of mother-in-law, right? Mother-in-law's mother, thank you. Mother-in-law's mother from this particular pasuk. Rava says, no, the point of contention is something else. The Machlokes of Rebbe says, what is the status of a mother-in-law after the death of the wife? So again, Reuven's married to Rachel passed. So obviously, when Reuven's married to Rachel, so Reuven's mother-in-law, Rachel's mother, is prohibited to him. What happens when Rachel dies? Right? Does the mother-in-law prohibition still remain? So Rabbi Shmuel says yes. In fact, the mother-in-law prohibition remains even after the death of the wife, to the point that the relationship is punishable by death. But Rabbi Akiva Savar Yisroel. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, holds it's only an Isser. Now, when we say only an Isser, it's Asser, but it's not Sreifa. Okay, we will say that brings to a conclusion our sugya on Sreifa Shkoyach. Says the Mishnah. Onto a lighter topic. Right? So we go from Sreifa to Hereg. Hereg, remember, again, is decapitation. Right? Killing someone with a sword. So these are the people who are put to death. Remember, the other word for Hereg is Saif. But again, classically it's called Hereg, decapitation with the sword. So these are the people who are killed with the sword. Who are they? Number one, Harotzeach, someone who murders someone else. Okay, number two, Yanshe Ir Nidachas. Remember, Ir Nidachas is a city which worshipped Avodah Zarah. So halacha l'maisa, the city is put to death. It's killed by Saif. Rotzeach shehika esre'ehu be'even o be'barzel. Or a murderer who killed someone, who killed his friend, who killed Re'ehu, with a stone or with iron. V'kavash alav l'soch hamayim. So we'll say these sugyas are going to get very interesting. Now, kavash also l'soch hamayim means he holds his friend's head under the water. Okay, so he holds his friend's head under the water. Or he holds his friend in the fire. I mean, they're not really friends, clearly. But again, you understand the point. So the Gemara, I will say, brother, it always struck me. Re'ehu could also mean fellow. It doesn't have to be like chaver. But it is interesting that how Chazal and the Torah itself also does this. That there are so many other lashonos you could use for someone else. Acher, someone else. I will say it's fascinating to see that, in general, right? Rabbi Nachman writes that when one commits an avera, every avera always has like a twofold component to it. On one hand, there's the avera, but there's also the lost opportunity for a mitzvah. Right? In the moment that I could have been doing in the moment that I was doing the avera, I could have been doing something positive at that very same moment. So there's like this duality of loss in the commission of an avera. It's true interpersonally as well, right? For every person that I harm and for every enemy, there could have been a friend. So it's interesting to see that the Torah Dafka refers, see here, Reuven's killing Shimon, he's holding his head under the water, and the Torah calls him Re'ehu. It didn't have to be this way. So there's that duality, there's that avis, that terrible mistreatment, but there's also the loss of perhaps what could have been a friendship. Okay, in any event, so it holds him into the fire. Now we're going to see all of this, and Shimon is unable to take his head out of the water, or he's unable to get out of the fire, and therefore he dies. Chayev, ultimately again, Reuven is going to be chayev for this. That's an act of bloodshed. Another case, what happens if Reuven pushes Shimon into the water, or pushes Shimon into the fire, and ultimately again, Shimon could have gotten up. He could have gotten up, but he didn't. Umeis, and he dies. Pater. In those cases, Reuven had pater. Shabbos said this is quite fascinating. Even though Reuven pushed Shimon into the water, and even though Reuven pushed Shimon into the fire, since Shimon could have gotten up but failed to do so, Reuven is not liable. Shisa bas hakelef. If again Reuven goes ahead and incites a dog to go ahead and bite Shimon, he incites him to bite Shimon. Or shisa bas hakelef as hanachash. Pater. ultimately again he's pater. Why? Because we'll say this is going to be a case of grama. This is causation. Because in these cases over here, Reuven is creating a force, but he's not the direct damager. It's the dog that is damaging. It is the snake that is damaging. Even though, again, Reuven riled it up. Here's Shikbas Hanachash. What happens if Reuven took a snake? Right? Literally held the snake's mouth open and put the snake's fangs into Shimon. Now, interestingly enough, it's the venom that kills Shimon, not Reuven. What's the halacha over here? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda Mechayev. Rabbi Huda says, no, in that case, that's direct koach, and therefore Reuven is going to be chayiv. V'chachamim poacher, and the Chacham on the other hand say that Reuven is going to be pater. All right, so we'll say a lot to talk about in this sugya. Let's see the Gemara. Amar Shmuel, mipnei malo ne'emra yad bebarzal. So we'll say this is very interesting. Look at Rashi. First Rashi in the Gemara. Last short line in Rashi. Lo ne'emar yad, kima shene'emar be'even yad or be'kli eitz yad. So we'll say in the sugyas where it talks about killing someone, the lashon of the pasuk is if Reuven kills Shimon be'even yad, even yad. Now, what that means is literally it could mean a stone that he's holding in his hand. But what we really mean to understand is over yad means that you have the ability to kill someone with that evan. In other words, the halach is we're going to see that in order to be liable for going ahead and killing someone, halacha l'maisa, the item that you kill the person with has to be capable of delivering a death blow. If it's not capable of delivering like in other words, if I go ahead and I take Reuven takes a pebble, almost like a little pebble, and he throws it at Shimon. And somehow, and again, under normal circumstances, what would have happened if you threw a pebble at someone? Whatever, they'd get a ding, But it happened to be that it hit Shimon in a way, and however it hit him, and he dies. Reuven's not going to be chayav for that, because what he did not really have the capacity and the ability to cause death. So that's why Torah used lashon of yad by Evan and by eitz. So the Gemara says, why doesn't it use the same lashon of yad by barzal? Very interesting. Shabarzal me'mis b'chol shu. Because ultimately, again, barzal is different. Barzal is different. That when it comes to wood. So ultimately, again, when it comes to iron has the unique ability to go ahead and kill. Iron is even in a very small shear. So the Gemara says, so Rebbe says, so it was known before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that iron has the ability to kill in even the smallest amount. Therefore, lo nitna Torah bo shir. Therefore, the Torah didn't give a shir. Now, what's unique about iron? So Rashi points out over here, Shabar zolem misbechoshu is the third white line on the bottom. Aide triva shetochev lo ma'at beveshet obelibo. That because iron could stab. So because iron could stab, therefore even the smallest amount of iron has the ability to cause death. Therefore, the Torah doesn't use the lashon of yad. Yad means that normally the item you use to kill someone has to have a shear in order to generate liability. When it comes to iron, because iron is so dangerous, halacha l'maisa, even without a shear, ultimately again there's going to be liability. V'hani mili de barze mivraz. But this is all assuming that what? This is all assuming that halacha l'maisa, one went ahead and pierced an organ that could be fatal. Okay. Supposed to now listen to this. So now remember, the Mishnah said, if Reuven goes and holds Shimon under the water, there's liability for that. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, the Sefer Abusa Kamashmalon. Both the Reish and the Sefer, the beginning and the end of the Braisa, both teach us tremendous lessons. What are the lessons? Here we go. So the Gemara says, Reish Abusa Kamashmalon. In the first case, the Mishnah teaches us a Chiddush. Afal gav, delav ihu dachvo, kevan de'in yachal lalos misham umeis chayiv. So we'll say in case number one of the Mishnah, it was case number one. Case number one is where Reuven holds Shimon's head under the water. And again, Shimon dies, Reuven is chayiv. What's the chiddush there? The chiddush there is, how did Shimon get into the water? I don't know. But Reuven didn't put him there. Or Reuven didn't necessarily put him there. Right? So in other words, the chiddush in the Reisha is, even though Shimon's already in the water, Reuven didn't put him there. But if Reuven comes up, I'm saying the names wrong. right? Reuven didn't put Shimon, he didn't push him in the water. Shimon was in the water, but Reuven comes along and holds Shimon's head under the water. There's liability for that, even though Reuven did not place him there. Sefer Abu Sakamashmal, what's the chiddush of the Sefer? Afagav the dachvo, kivan the yachalalas misham umeis pater. The chiddush of the Sefer is, remember what's happening in the Sefer? Reuven pushed Shimon into the water. But now again, and let's say Shimon dies, if Shimon had the ability to get himself out of the water and didn't do so, even though he was only in the water because Reuven pushed him there, Reuven will not be liable. Incredible. Kavash minolan. So we'll say, how do I know that there's liability for holding someone's head under the water or for holding someone in the fire? In other words, that here, I didn't create these circumstances, right? Shimon may already be in the water, or really, Shimon may already even be in the fire. How do I know that if Reuven holds his head under the water, holds him in the fire, that Reuven is liable? It's very interesting. Amar Shmuel, Damar Kra, Pasuk says, O be'eva. Or if Reuven treats Shimon with animosity or hatred. So Lashon of Eva, O be'eva hiko. If he hits him with hatred or animosity. The Rabbos is Hametzamtzem. So this goes ahead and includes Metzamtzem. Now what does Metzamtzem mean? Literally again, constricting. Metzamtzem means holding someone in place. In this case over here, Reuven holding Shimon's head underwater, or Reuven holding Shimon in the fire. Rabbi said there's a tremendous Moshe Haskell in this as well, that it's interesting. How does the Torah define animosity? What's Eva? Metzamtzem. So I'll say, what does Metzamtzem mean? Sometimes when you constrict a person, you don't allow a person to move. I don't mean physically, well, this is talking about physically, but sometimes, especially in relationships, we back people into corners, and they cannot be the people they need to be, or they cannot accomplish the things they need to accomplish because someone is constricting them. There's tzimtzum. When you constrict a person, that's Eva. That's animosity. It's animosity. So much of life and so much of relationships is allowing people to be who they need to be without trying to make them in our own image. In relationships, there is a natural Yetzer Hara, whether it's in parenting or whether it's in marriage, to make other people in your image, right? I need my kids to look like this, to be like this. I need my spouse to be like this. That's not what relationships are about. Relationships are not about making someone else in your image. Relationships are about forming and creating beautiful synergistic partnerships so that you could accomplish more as a collective than you could accomplish as an individual. And when you're mitzamtzim someone, when you constrict someone, the Gemara says that's Eva, that's animosity. Incredible. Ho Gavra, story. There was a guy, so Reuven had Shimon's animal, and what did Reuven do? Reuven tied up Shimon's animal so that it couldn't move and left it in the sun. And as a result, the animal died. Heat exposure, the animal died. So what's the halacha? Ravina Mechayev. Ravina said that the guy was potter. Right? We'll call him Reuven. Rav Chabarav said he was potter. Okay, so what's going on over here? Ravina Mechayev. So Ravina says, of course he's chayev. Why? When it comes to murder or an accidental murder, is not the same thing as an intentional one. And extenuating circumstances is not the same thing as premeditated. Yet, right? So we know that when it comes to murder, right, even though again, accidental killing is not the same thing as intentional. Ones is not the same thing as ratzon. Yet Rabbi say, what's the halacha if you keep a person in place? If Reuven keeps Shimon's head under the water, what's the halacha? He's chayiv. So too again, Ravina wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa in this case over here, where Reuven tied up Shimon's animal, so that Shimon's animal cannot move out of the sun and died as a result of heat exposure, Reuven's going to be chayiv. So top of Ayin Zayin, Nezikin, sha'asaban shogi kamezid va'onis kiratzon. Now both say, and I remember when it comes to Nezikin, when it comes to damages, now what's the halacha by damages? We'll say, interesting enough, damages, accidental damage is the same thing as intentional. Ones is the same thing as ratzon. Why? Why is that? What's kind of like the operating, not phrase, but the operating concept by Nezikin? Adam muad liolam. A person is always responsible for his actions. So when it comes to damages, to say, oh, I'm so sorry, there was an accident. Okay, I forgive you. Pay up. Right? Oh, it wasn't only extenuating circumstances. I understand. Pay up. You're always responsible for damages. So that's Ravina's Kavachom, which is very interesting. So when it comes to taking a life, so where there's a distinction between intentional, unintentional, ones and ratzon, yet you're chayiv for confining someone, right? If Reuven holds Shimon's head underwater, he's going to be chayiv for that. So therefore, again, if Reuven ties Shimon's animal in the sun and the animal dies, Reuven's going to be chayiv for that. Barav poter. Rav Acharav says, no, the poter. Why? Amr Shashemai Taima Davua Da'abo, the poter. Why is it that ultimately Rav Acha Barav is poter? Why is that? Amr Kra, Mos Yumas Ramaker Rodseachu. So the pasuk says that the murderer will be put to death. But Rodseachu dechayev lon mitzamtzem benezikin lo chayev lon mitzamtzem. So ultimately, again, Rav Mesharshia's, this is fascinating. Sorry, Rav Acha's idea is like this: the din of mitzamtzem is one that is brought up by nezikin, by damages. I'm sorry, excuse me. The idea of mitzamtzem is one that is brought up by bloodshed. It's brought up by Rodseach. Ultimately, again, the din of mitzamtzem is not brought up by nezikin, which I want to point out. Remember, we just learned out, the Gemara just asked, how do you know that you're chai for mitzamtzem? How do you know that you're chai for confining someone in a situation which results in their death? So remember again, what did the Gemara base it on? The Gemara says, O be'eva hikol biado viamos. Remember, learn that from O be'eva. That's talking about a case of murder. So Rav Acha will say, the concept of mitzamtzem is dafka brought down in a case of murder. It's not brought down in the case of nezikin, and therefore it doesn't apply. Others both say, so this is really quite fascinating, just to understand that this fundamental machlokes over here. So according to Rav Acha, let's work back, according to Rav Acha, the only time you're chayiv for damages is when you actively damage someone with your own koach. But if, let's say again, in this case, where Reuven takes Shimon's animal, ties it up in the sun, and the animal can't move and the animal dies, Rav Acha is going to say, you're not chayiv for that. It's not good. It's not good. We don't, obviously the halacha doesn't condone it, but there's no legal recourse that Shimon has under those circumstances. So fundamental machlokes. So again, Ravina understands that the din of mitzamtzem applies both by bloodshed as well as by nezikin. Rav Acha, it only applies by bloodshed, doesn't apply by nezikin. Incredible. Amar Rava. Another example. I will say now, I'll tell you this as we go along. So halacha l'maisa, the Rambam Paskin is like Ravina, that we hold that mitzamtzem is chayiv both by bloodshed and by nezikin. So therefore, again, if Reuven ties up Shimon's animal in the sun in a way that the animal is going to die of heat exposure, and the animal dies of heat exposure, ultimately Reuven's chayiv. Now, we have a couple of other pieces we're going to have to qualify over the rest of this stuff, but just understand, nugget number one, we paskin like, well, it's not number one, we've had a lot of nuggets so far, but nugget number whatever, right? We paskin like Ravina. That one is chayiv for mitzamtzem, for confining someone or something, both by bloodshed, by rotzeach, as well as by nezikin damages. Okay, let's go back to Amarava. Kafso umeis barav, pater. Very interesting. What happens if Reuven ties up Shimon, and Shimon dies of starvation? Whatever, 5 days later, Shimon's had no food, no water, however long a person can survive without food and water, and Shimon dies. So Rava says that Reuven is pater. Rabbi say now, why? Which sounds very strange to us. What's the logic of that? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi's in the first short line. Kafso meisparav, de bishasha kafso, ein kan dvar hariga. V'arav ba me'elav, v'holich v'chazak, la'achar zman kol shah, v'lo dami letzamtzem b'mayim, u'ba'or dehorig mizuman. So let's listen to this. Essentially, right, we paskin that mitzamtzem, holding someone in place, and them dying as a result of being held in place is chayiv. That is only if the force which brings about death is present at the beginning of the event. So, for example, Reuven holds Shimon's head underwater, right? So Reuven is going to be chayiv. Why? Because the water, right, which is the vehicle of death, is right there and present, right? Similarly, again, in the previous case, if you notice, right, Reuven tied Shimon's animal up in the blazing sun. The sun is there. But in a case where, let's say, Reuven creates a reality for Shimon, but there's no death force that's present in that moment, then Reuven will not be chayiv. So, for example, Reuven ties Shimon up. Shimon dies of starvation 5 days later. Okay, at the time that it's not okay, but at the time that he tied him up, again, there was no starvation, right? There was no death force. So, because there was no death force, therefore, there is no technical liability. Obviously, in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm sure the Ribbon Shalom is not smiling upon Reuven for what he's done. But we're talking about in a very technical, legalistic framework, is there liability or not? Could Bezdin execute Reuven for what he did? So we'll say this is a very important principle. In order to be chayiv for mitzamtzim, for confining someone, the death force has to be present at the time the person was confined. If the death force only comes later, there is no liability. Next, Vamarava, another example. Vamarava, Kafsa b'chama umeis, b'tzina umeis chayiv. If Reuven tied Shimon up, and he tied him up in the blazing sun, right? Or he tied him up in the freezing cold, then Shimon dies, chayiv. Ultimately again, so Reuven is going to be chayiv. But on the other hand, sof chama lavo, sof tzina lavo. Let's say Reuven ties Shimon up at night. And at night, it's fine. There's no sun. But when the sun comes up the next morning, by the time it gets to midday, Shimon's going to die of heat exposure. So Reuven's pater. Why? Same idea. Why? Because at the time that Reuven tied Shimon up, there was no present death force. So because of that, ultimately again, Reuven is going to be pater. Because sof chama lavo, sof tzina lavo, pater. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Rava says, Kafsa lifneari. So this is very interesting. If Reuven tied Shimon up in front of a lion, pater. That's quite fascinating. Reuven is pater. They will say now, why is that exactly? Take a look at Rashi. And Rashi is right across. Kafsa lifneari pater. Di'i nami lo haya kafos. Lo haya yachal lahatza atzal minari. Now, perhaps we do not pass him this way, but this is fascinating. Why? Because they will say, clinical tests have shown that your chances of survival with a lion, whether you're bound or not bound, are non-existent, right? Rava says your chances of survival are no better if you're untied with a lion than if you're tied up with a lion. So therefore, it's interesting. So Rava says, if Reuven put, and I will say, and the idea over here is we're going to see this, that Lamaisa, remember again, with a wild animal, we saw this in the Mishnah, about Shisa Basachav inciting the dog. Those cases seem a lot more like grama, like causation, because it's not Reuven killing Shimon, but rather what is it? It's the lion killing Shimon. So the fact that Reuven went ahead and tied Shimon up, okay, his chances would have been no better had he been untied. So halacha Lamaisa, he's part. And it happens to be, we're going to see that Rambam Paskins, in a case like that, you actually chayiv. But again, we'll see it for later. Rava says, Kasach ne'ari pater, lifnei yitushin chayiv. So this is very interesting. If Reuven ties Shimon up with yitushin, what are yitushin? Yitushin are gnats. So I guess a person could die as a result of prolonged gnat stinging. Yeah, yes, some maybe disease, maybe whatever else, reaction. So the Mazel will say, what's the idea over here? Is because if Reuven was untied, what could he do? Right? Rashi points out he could shoo it away. The fact that he's tied up now, that ultimately again results in his death. So as Rashi says, Afilu lifnei yitushin nami pater. Rashi says no, even with yitushin, even with gnats, he's still going to be pater. Why? Hani azli v'hani asu. Because the gnats that he dies from are not the gnats that are present at the time that he's tied up. Once again, the death force is not present. How does it work with the gnats? This gnat chevra comes, this gnat chevra goes, right? So again, who causes it? It's the collective gnat chevra that goes ahead and causes his death. But again, the death force is not present at the time that he is tied up. Incredible. So we'll say, so again, nugget of information over here, same idea as before. In order to be chayiv for mitzamtzim, so now we've established number one, you're chayiv for mitzamtzim, both by nezikin or by misa, by rotzeach, as well as by nezikin. Nugget number two, you're only chayiv for mitzamtzim if the death force is present at the time that you tied up the individual. Incredible. So let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Itmar, Kaf alav gigis, this is very interesting, Upar alav ma'azifa, if let's say Reuven took a barrel, and he put the barrel over Shimon, right? Not put Shimon over the barrel, right? But he went ahead and he put the barrel over Shimon. Now Rashi says over here, actually right across to the right, Kaf alav gigis, umeis bahavla. And ultimately, again, now apparently the issue with going ahead and putting a barrel over someone is they suffocate. Over time, they will suffocate. So the Gemara says, Kavalei kigigis, uparla maziva, or Shimon sleeping. And what does Reuven do? Reuven goes ahead and opens up a piece of the ceiling so that frigid cold air comes in while Shimon's sleeping and ultimately kills him. Rashi says over here, good. So he opens up the ceiling and cold air comes in. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, Rabbi Zera, Chad Amar Chayiv, V'Chad Amar Pater. So machlokes, Rav and Rabbi Zera, one says Chayiv, one says Pater. What's going on over here? This time, the Ravu, the Amar Pater. So I will say, Bepashtos, Rava is the one who says Pater. Why? Because what did Rava say before? Damar Rava, Kafso or Meis Berav Pater. Remember, you're about to say, Rava was the one who just said that if Reuven ties Shimon up and Shimon later dies of starvation, that Reuven is Pater. Why? Because the death force wasn't present at the time of the tying up. So again, Bipashtus in these cases as well. When Reuven goes ahead and puts the barrel over Shimon, again, right now there's air. Or when he opens up the ceiling, right now there's a draft. But Lamaisa, again, one can make the argument that maybe the death force is not present, and therefore again you would be patur in this case as well. To which the Gemara says not necessarily. Tistayim Rabbi Zeri, maybe not. Maybe this price is actually Rabbi Zera. How so? The Gemara says Tistayim Rabbi Zera he damar patur. Maybe it's Rabbi Zera holds that you're patur. Why? What Rabbi Zera? See, damar Rabbi Zera. Listen to this. Hai man da'ayli lechavre bebeisa deshisha. If someone takes his friend, right? Reuven takes his friend into a house made of marble. And I will say now, again, the chap over here is Rashi says, Beisa de Shisha, Shesasum Biyoser, Ve'ein Heval Ha'or, V'haner Yacholat Seis Mimenu. A house that is made of marble could be made airtight. So Reuven puts Shimon in an airtight home. Va'adlik Shraga Umeis. And then he goes ahead and he lights a candle, right? And Shimon dies. What's the halacha? Chayiv. And this is fascinating. Now, why is that? Why is it Michayiv? By lighting the candle, what does Reuven do? What is Reuven doing? He's taking up all the oxygen, right? So because he's taking up all the oxygen, therefore he is responsible for the death of Shimon. Now the Gemara says, "Time of the shraga." Now the only reason he's chayiv is because he actively lit the candle. What you can infer from this is, had he not lit the candle, but he just put Shimon in an airtight home, then halacha I say would not be chayiv, right? Why? Because the death force wasn't present at the time that he confined him. To which the Gemara says, "Time of the shraga." The reason why Reuven is chayiv is because he lit a candle. Ha lo shraga lo. If he would not have lit the candle, he would not be chayiv. So it could very well be that our Bryce reflects the view of Rabbi Zera, to which the Gemara says, not necessarily. Amri, Shasam, lo Amri. The Gemara says, it's not necessarily comparable. I'll tell you why. Hasam, in the case ultimately, again, in the case over here, below Shragal Maskal Havla, in the case of the airtight home, the issue of Yerabosai is, apparently the kindling of the candle goes ahead and somehow also taints the air. So apparently the actual act of going ahead and lighting the candle, had you not lit the candle, so Shimon would have been just fine. I mean, for some prolonged amount of time, but would have been fine. Lo maschel havla b'shaita, Amud Beis. Hacha, in the case over here, of the barrel, of the bias, below shraganami maschel havla b'shaita. Suppose I say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, so the cases are not really comparable. Hasam below struggle or maschal, without the candle, the putrid air would not have started at the right time. But over here, below struggle nami maschal havla b'shaita. But over here, ultimately, again, even without the candle, the putrid air begins. So lav dafka that you could compare both cases. Now, both saying that interestingly enough, the way we paskin in this case over here is now. So the interest, what comes out over here is machlokes, right? So Reuven puts the barrel on top of Shimon, or right, what was the other case? Reuven puts the barrel on top of Shimon, or opens up the roof, right? Then it becomes cold. So what is the halacha? So it's machlokes. Now the only machlokes is ultimately who says what. But it's clear that there is a fundamental machlokes as to whether or not, again, there is liability in this particular case. So we'll say, this case we'll have to see exactly what happens, because this case is a little bit different. Because on one hand, The death force is present, but the death force is not immediate. It's prolonged. In other words, at a certain point in time, Shimon will run out of air in the barrel, but right now he has enough. At a certain point in time, perhaps the cold will kill Shimon, but right now it's not an impact. So we'll see this case in Meretz Hashem, what we do with this case, because this is kind of like a little bit of an in-between, where on one hand the death force is present, but the death force is not necessarily present in its entire full amount. So again, hold on to this case. What we're going to loop back. The Rambam, Meretz Hashem, put all of this together in a beautiful panoramic halachic view for us. We'll just point out how incredibly striking this lashon over here is. That kafa lein kigigis, right? So what happens? So Reuven is putting Shimon a barrel, right? So right, the lashon was kafa ale gigis. Reuven goes ahead and puts a barrel over Shimon. This lashon is very reminiscent, right? Why is it reminiscent? It's the same lashon that the Gemara Masechah Shabbos uses for Har Sinai, right? That the Gemara says, the beautiful Gemara, dramatic Gemara, Kadosh Baruch Hu lifted up the mountain over us. And what? Held it over us, kigigis, like a barrel. So apparently, what's fascinating about a barrel? This is good information to know. Don't play on the inside of a barrel. Why not? Because if it tips over in front of you, apparently, you could suffocate inside of a barrel. Inside of a barrel. The Ribbon Shalom, I think, was telling us something incredibly amazing. Sometimes a person could feel like they're suffocating in Yiddishkeit. It could happen. It could happen that a person feels overwhelmed, ultimately, again, by the responsibilities, overwhelmed by the realities that sit upon our shoulders. And sometimes the gigis of Torah could ultimately feel overwhelming. It's almost as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is validating that emotion. We all have moments like this where I know what I have to do, or I know what I should be doing, but the reality is it feels very overwhelming for me. Feels very overwhelming, and it feels incredibly suffocating. And the Rebbe Shalom is saying, I get it, I understand it. Yeah, at times it could be beautiful, and at times it could be inspiring, and at times it could actually be suffocating. That's the end of the Vart. It's the end of the Vart. They all say, sometimes when someone is struggling with something, there's a great phrase called toxic positivity. Right? What's toxic positivity? Toxic positivity, and we all know people like this, where when you're struggling with something, you go over to them. What do they say? What do they say to you? It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. And what's often your reaction to that person? I literally want to kill you with my own hands, right? Like, be quiet. Be quiet. I know it's going to be okay. I know it's going to be okay. I got it. I'm not right. I've been around. I know I'm not going to, I'm going to be fine. But that's not what I want from you right now. Don't tell me it's going to be okay in your sweet, calm, it's going to be okay. You're so strong. You're going to be fine. Shut up. Right? I know. I understand. I got it. Right? I got it. Sometimes what a person needs when they're going through a difficult time is just some empathy. It's just some validation. That's all. Don't tell. I know it's going to be okay. I know I'll make it through. I know I'll stand strong. I'll remain standing. But just validate what it is I'm going through. That's all. Just tell me I understand. Just tell me it must be really hard. Or I'm so sorry that you're in this predicament. Or is there something that I can do to help? Don't tell me it's going to be okay. And I think about the godless over here is that where do we learn this out? Where do we learn that toxic positivity is truly toxic? And sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just good old empathy and just be there for them. It's Kadosh Baruch Hu. Kadosh Baruch Hu, I got it. This Torah thing, this Yiddishkeit thing, it's big. It's big. And I got it. Sometimes it can feel like it's suffocating. That's it. But you can do it, right? But you'll be great. No, I got it. Just know I'm right here along with you. Just know that at the end of the day, I'm the one HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm the one who's holding the barrel. It's not someone else holding the barrel. I, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, am holding the barrel. So because I'm holding the barrel, we got this together. But I certainly understand that at times, your responsibilities may feel profoundly overwhelming. All right, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Amar Rava, Dachfal Labar is a very interesting case. Dachfal Labar, the Sulam Babar. Listen to this. Reuven pushes Shimon into a pit. And what happens? But there was a ladder in the pit. So remember again, just to understand what's happening over here. Now, interestingly enough, remember, a pit also has a hevel, right? A pit, we've seen this before, we've seen this like in our Baba Kama days, right? That a pit has some type of like noxious fumes inside of it also. So clearly, if Shimon stays in the pit, he's going to die. The good news is, there's a ladder. But what happens? Uba achar v'silko, or what happens? Now, so just understand the timeline of events. Reuven pushes Shimon into a pit, but the pit has a ladder. What happened? Now someone else came along. Uba achar v'silko. Someone else came along and removed the ladder. Okay. Afilu hu kadam v'silko. Maybe even Reuven himself came along and took out the ladder. Pater. Ultimately, Reuven is pater. Why is Reuven pater? Deba'idna d'shadje yochala losu. The was saying the chap over here is, as long as at the time that Reuven pushed Shimon, there was a ladder. As long as it was there at the time of the pushing, then what? Then remember again, this was not an act that could have caused the death of Shimon. So just to even illustrate this in the most dramatic way, imagine for a moment, Reuven standing with Shimon at the edge of the pit, the ladder is there. Reuven pushes Shimon. Before Shimon hits the ground of the pit, Reuven takes out the ladder. Reuven's still not going to be chayiv. Why? Because everything is determined by the moment of the pushing, right? Because that was the act. And since at the moment that Reuven pushed Shimon, the ladder was present, therefore this was not an act that could have caused bloodshed. Because again, Lamaisa, the ladder was there. It wasn't, obviously, again, we're talking about the fact that Reuven will not be technically liable. Obviously, Reuven's a bad guy. He's a bad guy, right? And things catch up with bad people. Rashi says over here, Kadam v'silko, Kadam nifilaso shalzeh, but idna d'shadje yachal lalosu, upatra al d'chiyah, mishum siluk lamazes d'chayuve, tigrama ba'almahu. So I'll say, it's fascinating, since at the time that Reuven pushed Shimon, the ladder was there, even though Reuven himself then took the ladder out before Shimon hit the ground, ultimately, again, Reuven is not going to be chayiv. Incredible. So Rava says, similar idea, Zarak chetz utris biyado. Let's say Reuven shot an arrow at Shimon. But good news, Shimon had a shield. Uba achar v'natlo, but someone that after Reuven shot the arrow, someone came and took the shield, afiluhu kada v'natlo, or even if Reuven himself took the shield, pater, Reuven's going to be pater. Why? For in other words, remember, everything is determined at the moment that Reuven shot the arrow. And at the moment that Reuven shot the arrow, what was the Metzias? Shimon could not be harmed by the arrow. So therefore, this act of shooting the arrow was not an act which could cause bloodshed. Because it couldn't cause bloodshed, therefore, again, Reuven's not going to be chayiv. Even if, again, let's say Reuven's lightning fast. He shoots the arrow, and somehow after he shoots the arrow, he goes and he grabs Shimon's shield. So that now the arrow kills Shimon. Reuven's going to be pater, because at the time that he killed Shimon, the arrow could not have killed Shimon. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. Another case. Good. Amrava. Zarak chetz. Listen to this. Let's say Reuven shot an arrow at Shimon. B'samon biyado. But it's okay, because Shimon had the remedy for an arrow. In other words, I guess the arrow could have pierced him, but he had a bandage, he had antiseptic, whatever he needed in order to bandage up the wound, and he would have been just fine. Okay? Uba achar pizran. So after the arrow was shot, someone else came along and stole his medication. Afiluhu kadam pizran, or Reuven himself came and stole the medication. Pater, ultimately Reuven is going to be pater. Why? We'll say it's all the same theme. In order to be chai for bloodshed, it has to be that at the time of the act, the death force was present. But if at the time of the act, the death force was not present. So again, the ladder was in the pit, right? The shield was in the hands of Shimon. Shimon had the remedy for an arrow piercing. Even though it was subsequently removed after he was thrown into the pit, or after he released the arrow, or after he went ahead and shot the arrow, and even if Reuven himself removed it, still going to be pater. Why? Because at the time of the act was not capable of causing the death of Shimon. Incredible. Rashi says, Hilchach afilu samana b'shuk. The truth is, even if, let's say Shimon didn't have the remedy in his hand, but the remedy was readily available in the marketplace, right? So therefore, again, even in that kind of case, it's clear that Reuven's act was not one which could have caused bloodshed. What happens if halacha l'maisa, at the time that Reuven shot the arrow, Shimon didn't have the medicinal remedy. But then after he shot the arrow, Shimon came upon the medicinal remedy. What's the halacha? In that case, ultimately, again, Ruvain is not going to be chayiv. There was interestingly enough, this is interesting because in this case over here, remember, at the time that Ruvain shot the arrow, Shimon did not have the remedy. He didn't have the remedy, but since halacha l'maisa, he did get the remedy before Ruvain was brought to Din Torah. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, Ruvain would not be chayav. Rabbi, so we have to stop over here for today. There's much more. Again, we're just throwing out all of these cases right now. Mir Hashem, tomorrow's daf will really consolidate this into a comprehensive framework. Incredible Gemara. Shkayach, everyone.